Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back, way back, into the foggy world of ancient myths. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe put your phone on Do Not Disturb, because we're about to talk about a horse. Not just any horse though, probably the most famous horse in history. A horse that technically didn't even exist, but, details. This is the story of the Trojan Horse, or at least the half-myth, half-archaeological, half-drunken poet version of it that has come down to us through the ages. Yes, that's three halves, don't worry about it. Ratios were never Homer's strong point. Now, the image is iconic. The giant wooden horse on wheels, the Greeks hiding inside, the gullible Trojans hauling it into their city thinking it was a peace offering, only to get wrecked by a surprise ambush. A bedtime story for kids who liked their bedtime stories with just a touch of genocide. But like most of the ancient tales we think we know, the reality, or the possible reality, is far stranger, much murkier, and much less cinematic. No Brad Pitt with shiny hair in sight. So let's breathe in, breathe out, and start unraveling how a myth about a horse became one of the most enduring symbols of both human stupidity and human storytelling. We begin, unsurprisingly, with Homer, because of course we do. Homer, the wandering bard who gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey. He is our main source for what the ancients thought went down at Troy, or at least for the parts he decided to sing about. Now, here's the funny part. Homer's Iliad, it doesn't actually include the Trojan horse at all. That's right, the thing everyone associates with Troy, not in there. The Iliad covers like 3 weeks of fighting. It's basically a wartime soap opera featuring Achilles being moody, Agamemnon being annoying, and Hector tragically not surviving long enough to have his own spin-off. The horse? That sneaks in through later sources. The Odyssey mentions it briefly when Odysseus is bragging about how clever he was. Classic Odysseus. Oh, did I mention that time I invented a giant horse and tricked an entire city? No big deal, just me being me. Other later works, like Virgil's Aeneid, give us the full cinematic version. The Greeks pretending to leaving the horse as a gift to the gods, the Trojans wheeling it inside, the warriors climbing out at night, and poof, Troy goes down in flames. It's neat. It's tragic. It's the ultimate don't trust strangers bearing gifts parable. But let's pause the myth reel here. Because historians, archaeologists, and linguists have been side-eyeing this story for centuries, and not just because it sounds like a Monty Python sketch. So, first question, did the horse actually exist? Short answer, probably not. Long answer, well, it depends on what you mean by horse. You see, in ancient Greek, the word hippos means horse. Yes, but hippos could also mean something shaped like a horse, or something metaphorically connected to horses, which leaves us with wiggle room the size of an entire city gate. Some scholars argue that the horse was never a literal animal statue. It could have been a siege engine, some kind of giant wooden battering ram or tower, nicknamed the horse because of the shape, or maybe because soldiers loved naming dangerous contraptions after animals. Think of it like calling your car the Beast, but with more flaming arrows involved. Another theory is earthquakes. Yes, earthquakes. The region around Troy was prone to them, and one of the gods associated with earthquakes was Poseidon, whose sacred animal just so happened to be the horse. So, in one version, the horse was actually a metaphor for an earthquake sent by Poseidon that conveniently knocked down Troy's walls. The Greeks roll in, plunder the place, and then later poets, well, they smooth it into a much cooler story involving carpentry and sneaky soldiers. And then there's the possibility that the horse was a ship, a big wooden Greek warship, the kind sometimes decorated with horse symbols on the prow. So maybe the Trojans weren't hulling in a horse statue. Maybe they got caught off guard by a ship or ships bearing warriors inside. And then later poets, never ones to resist a good metaphor, turned horse-shaped ship into giant horse surprise toy. So, right out of the gate, pun entirely intended, we have at least 3 competing interpretations. Wooden horse statue? Siege machine? Earthquake metaphor? Warship? Take your pick. But before we get lost in scholarly rabbit holes, let's remind ourselves who the Trojans were, because they've kind of become stock characters in this whole myth. Always gullible, always falling for Greek tricks. The city of Troy itself was real. That much archaeologists agree on. Heinrich Schliemann, the 19th century treasure hunting enthusiast / archaeological menace, dug up the ruins in what is now Turkey. Of course, Schliemann also managed to destroy half the site in his excitement because careful preservation wasn't really his vibe. He was more of a smash things until gold appears type of historian. But still, we owe him some credit for proving Troy wasn't just a bedtime fairy tale. Multiple layers of Troy have been uncovered, because the city kept getting rebuilt on the same site, like a never-ending sequel franchise. Troy 6 and Troy 7 are the main contenders for being the Troy of Homer's time, both of which show signs of having been destroyed. Fire, rubble, collapsed walls, basically all the ingredients for an epic poem. So yes, something did happen. A war, a siege, some kind of catastrophic fall. But was it because of a giant wooden horse on wheels? Or was that just a bedtime story version of events invented by poets who like their history with more dramatic props? Let's float gently back to the Trojans themselves, because if we're going to make fun of gullible ancient royals, they deserve their share of the spotlight. Imagine you're Priam, king of Troy. You've been fighting the Greeks for 10 years. 10 years, long, exhausting years. Your best warriors have died. Your city is tired, hungry, and traumatized. Suddenly, the Greeks vanish. Their ships are gone. All they leave behind is a massive wooden horse. Now, some of your people are like, "Oh wow, a gift, let's bring it inside." Others, like poor Cassandra, the forever doomed prophetess, are screaming, "Don't do it! It's a trap! Seriously, don't!" And, of course, you listen to the optimistic ones. Because after 10 years of war, who doesn't want to believe the nightmare is over? So you wheel the horse in, throw a party, go to sleep, and wake up to flames, blood, and a lot of very smug Greeks. It's the ultimate historical should-have listened to that one friend scenario. Now, to keep things sleepy, let's zoom out for a moment, because the Trojan horse, whether literal or metaphorical, became a cultural symbol for something bigger. It's the archetype of the gift with strings attached, the ultimate cautionary tale. And poets loved it. Virgil, writing centuries later, gave us the most detailed account in the Aeneid. For him, the horse wasn't just a trick, it was destiny, a sign that Troy had to fall so Rome could one day rise. You know, the classic, "your tragedy is my origin story" angle. Then, later, medieval artists picked up the tale. Wooden horses appeared in tapestries, manuscripts, even paintings where the horse is drawn comically too small, like the Greeks must have been contortionists to fit inside. or comically too big, like the Trojans wheeled in an entire wooden skyscraper without batting an eye. And then, of course, the Trojan horse gets reborn in modern language. Computer viruses, business metaphors, cheesy action movies. The horse is everywhere, even though we have no idea if it was ever actually a horse. So tonight, as we drift along in this ancient fog, let's settle on this thought. The Trojan horse is less about whether it existed and more about what it represents. Human gullibility, human creativity, the way stories grow legs and hooves over time. And in the next stretch of our sleepy wanderings, we'll dig deeper into those competing theories, siege machines, ships, earthquakes, even cult symbols. Because if we're going to spend an hour and a half with this horse, we might as well get to know every possible version of it. But for now, let's rest with the image of a tired city, a too-good-to-be-true gift, and a wooden shape looming quietly against the walls of Troy. Part 2. Siege engines, earthquakes, and other horses. So, we left off with the Trojans, wheeling in their oversized lawn ornament, throwing a party, and basically handing over the keys to the city. Classic mistake. But let's pause the Homeric Netflix show for a while. Because behind the myth, there are other explanations. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys falling asleep while historians argue with each other, congratulations, you're in the right place. First stop, siege engines. Now, to understand this, imagine ancient warfare. No cannons, no tanks, no drones, just guys with swords, slings, and a lot of yelling. Cities had walls, thick, stubborn walls, and if you wanted in, you needed creativity. Enter the siege engine. Think of a massive wooden tower or a big battering ram rolled up to the gates, a kind of wheeled wooden monstrosity designed to smash, burn, or just scare the life out of defenders. In Greek, these could have been nicknamed horses. Why? Because, well, horses were the tanks of the ancient world. They were fast, strong, and intimidating. Naming your siege machine after one wasn't exactly Shakespearean wordplay, it was just practical. So some scholars suggest the Trojan horse was never a gift statue, but a memory of a siege weapon, a big, ugly contraption rolled up to Troy's gates. Over time, the boring details got polished into a better bedtime story. After all, giant wooden ram smashes walls doesn't quite stick in the imagination the same way as giant horse full of sneaky nen. And honestly, who wouldn't pick the horse version? It's fun, it's dramatic, it's got built-in irony. The siege engine theory is solid, but it's also, well, a little bit dull. Now, let's float to another theory. Earthquakes. Yes, because nothing says epic bedtime story like tectonic plates. See, Troy sat in a very shaky neighborhood. Earthquakes were common in the Aegean world. And when cities fell, walls cracked, and temples crumbled, people often saw the hand of the gods at work. And which god was responsible for earthquakes? Poseidon. Now, here's the twist. Poseidon's sacred animal was the horse. So one line of thinking goes, when later storytellers described the city falling to the horse, what they were really remembering was an earthquake, not carpentry, not carpenters hiding inside wood, but the earth itself shaking the walls down. The horse wasn't a literal horse, it was a symbol, a poetic way to say, the city fell to Poseidon's horse. And later bards, being bards, decided that sounded like a fun opportunity for drama and turned it into a wooden statue with wheels. It's not a bad theory. Earthquakes are invisible, unpredictable, and terrifying, but they also don't make for very entertaining storytelling. Imagine sitting around a campfire, and then the city fell because the ground moved a bit. It doesn't exactly scream blockbuster epic. Unless you're Poseidon's PR manager, in which case, mission accomplished. And then there's theory number 3, the ship. Ships were life in the Aegean. Greek warships, sleek and deadly, could cross seas with terrifying speed. And guess what some of them were called? Horses. The idea here is simple. The horse was never a statue, never a machine, never an earthquake metaphor. It was a ship. A warship decorated with horse symbols, carrying Greek warriors inside. Maybe it slipped into Troy's harbor, disgorged soldiers under cover of darkness, and that was that. Later generations, confused by the term horse, took it literally, and suddenly you have Trojans dragging a wooden animal into their city like clueless characters in a mythological sitcom. This theory is appealing because it makes some sense linguistically. Horse, as a ship, was a known metaphor. The only downside, once again, it doesn't have the same bedtime story magic. Imagine trying to sell that to an audience. The Greeks attacked with a ship. Just a ship. Not quite the same dramatic punch. And because historians love piling on possibilities, there's even more. Some say the horse was a siege ramp disguised as a religious object. Others think it was some kind of cult statue, gifted as a trick to smuggle Greek influence into the city. Basically, if it could be wooden, large, and vaguely horse-shaped, someone has suggested it. But all these theories have one thing in common. They're trying to explain why a horse. Out of all the animals in the ancient world, lions, bulls, goats, why would the Greeks supposedly build a giant horse? And the answer is probably because horses were cool. They were expensive. They were status symbols. They were the Ferraris of the Bronze Age. Owning one meant you were wealthy. Riding one meant you were elite. Putting your warriors inside one, well, that's just showing off. So whether it was metaphor, siege machine, or just a bard's flair for drama, the horse was a natural choice. But let's not forget the Trojans themselves. Because the best part of this whole story isn't really the horse. It's the Trojans falling for it. We mentioned Cassandra earlier, the prophetess, cursed to always tell the truth but never be believed, which honestly sounds like the worst group project assignment from the gods. She warned them. She said, "Don't bring it in." But no one listened. Instead, the Trojans dragged the thing inside, celebrated, and went to bed. And if you've ever made a bad decision at midnight that you regretted the next day, congratulations. You have something in common with the Trojans. So, what do we do with all this? On one level, the Trojan horse is just a fun myth, an ancient campfire story with just the right mix of cleverness, betrayal, and irony. On another level, it's a puzzle, a story where each generation of scholars tries to peel away the poetry to find the real history underneath. Siege machines, earthquakes, ships, symbols? Take your pick. And maybe, just maybe, the answer is all of them. Bits and pieces of real events stitched together by centuries of retelling, until eventually the messy truth hardened into myth. Because that's the thing about history. We like our stories tidy, clean, memorable. Nobody remembers Troy probably fell due to complicated factors including trade disputes, shifting alliances, and natural disasters. But everybody remembers the horse. So, let's stay here a moment. Picture it again. The city walls, the gates creaking open, the giant wooden horse rolling in, the Trojans cheering, Cassandra sighing, Laocoonus muttering, "I told you so." Which, to be fair, is still excellent advice today. But it's probably not how it happened, but it's how we remember it. And in the next stretch of our sleepy wanderings, we'll drift through how later generations, from Virgil to Renaissance painters, took this horse and made it bigger, shinier, and sometimes hilariously impractical. Because if you thought the myth was strange already, wait until you see what medieval artists did with it. Part 3. Virgil, Rome, and the glow-up of the Trojan horse. All right, we've wandered through the myths, the siege theories, the earthquakes, the ships. Now it's time to ask, what happens to a story once poets get their hands on it for a few centuries? Short answer, they embellish it. Long answer, they embellish it a lot. Enter Virgil. Virgil was a Roman poet writing in the 1st century BC. By then, Homer's tales were already ancient classics. The Romans adored Greek culture, stole most of it, really, but they also wanted their own spin. And so Virgil gave them the Aeneid, Rome's very own epic. The Aeneid basically functions like the ultimate prequel sequel. It tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who survives the fall of Troy and eventually wanders off to become the ancestor of the Romans. It's fan fiction, essentially, except it became national mythology. And in the Aeneid, the Trojan horse gets its big glow-up. Homer barely mentioned it. Virgil? He devotes an entire section to the drama. He adds the tears, the speeches, the emotional flourishes. He makes it cinematic. The horse isn't just a trick, it's destiny. Virgil wanted Rome to look like it had been ordained by the gods from the very beginning. So Troy had to fall spectacularly. And what better way than a horse-shaped deus ex machina? So, in Virgil's telling, we get details Homer left out. The Greeks build the horse, they sail away, or at least pretend to. The Trojans gather around the mysterious object, debating. Some are suspicious, others are hopeful. Laocoon delivers his famous warning, "I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts." But no one listens, because of course they don't. Then Virgil really leans into the tragedy. Laocoon is suddenly attacked by sea serpents. Yes, sea serpents that strangle him and his sons. The Trojans naturally interpret this as a sign that the gods want them to accept the horse, because apparently random sea serpent attack equals obviously divine approval. So they drag the horse in, party like it's 1199 BCE, and, well, you know the rest. Night falls, the Greeks creep out, fires start, Troy collapses. Cue the sad violin music. It's theatrical. It's poetic. It's exactly what Rome wanted, a grand, tragic fall that set the stage for their own rise. Now, whether or not you buy Virgil's version doesn't matter. What matters is that his telling became the telling. Through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and well into modern times, when people pictured the Trojan horse, they were basically picturing Virgil's horse. Which brings us to one of the most entertaining side effects of ancient stories, medieval art. If you've ever seen medieval illustrations of the Trojan horse, you know they are a treat. For one thing, proportions were optional. Some artists made the horse comically small, like the Greeks were folding themselves into it like clowns in a circus car. Tiny wooden toy horse, 20 warriors somehow squished inside, probably regretting their life choices. Other times, the horse is drawn absurdly large, towering over Troy's walls, like the Trojans decided to bring in a Trojan skyscraper without raising questions. The wheels? Sometimes there, sometimes not. Occasionally, the horse looks more like a camel or a donkey or some kind of vaguely horse-shaped loaf of bread. Medieval artists were working off vague descriptions and just sort of winged it. And then there's the matter of style. Some depictions show the horse with little trap doors like a dollhouse. You can literally see the Greek warriors peeking out of its belly, looking more mischievous than menacing. Others put banners on it, because apparently the Greeks wanted their giant wooden death trap to look festive. It's equal parts charming and hilarious, and it shows how flexible myths were. Every generation remade the horse in its own image. But why did the story stick so well? Why this horse, of all things? Part of the answer is that it worked as a moral lesson. The Trojan horse became a symbol of deception, of falling for appearances. It's the original too good to be true parable, and medieval audiences, who loved moral allegories, ate it up. Another part is that the horse was just visually irresistible. People love an image. They love a prop. A horse on wheels with secret soldiers inside is the kind of idea that burrows into your brain and refuses to leave. And once Virgil gave it a dramatic Roman stamp of approval, the horse wasn't going anywhere. Let's float here for a bit longer, because Virgil also adds something important: fate. In the Aeneid, Troy had to fall. The gods willed it. The horse was just the tool. That fatalism, the sense that you can't fight destiny, was very Roman. It lined up nicely with their own propaganda about how Rome was chosen to rule the world. Troy's tragedy was just Act 1 of Rome's rise. And here's the irony. The Romans saw themselves as descendants of the Trojans, yet they retold the story in a way that made the Trojans look gullible and doomed. Which is sort of like bragging, yeah, my ancestors were tricked by a giant wooden horse, but look at me now. Now, if you're still awake, and hopefully you're not, but just in case, let's gently move past Rome into later centuries. In medieval Europe, the Trojan horse became not just a myth, but a moral fable. Clergy used it as a sermon illustration. Beware false gifts, beware worldly temptations. In manuscripts, monks drew it alongside other cautionary tales like Adam and Eve, or that time Noah got drunk and embarrassed himself. By the Renaissance, artists started painting the horse with more detail now that they had rediscovered classical texts. But even then, you get wild interpretations. Sometimes the horse looks like a wooden carousel ride. Sometimes it looks suspiciously like a giant wine barrel. Sometimes it's armored like a knight's war horse, because apparently the Greeks were rolling out medieval upgrades before the Middle Ages even existed. So, through centuries, the horse kept evolving. From Homer's vague hint, to Virgil's epic spectacle, to medieval doodles, to Renaissance paintings. Each era saw itself reflected in the story. Each era made the horse its own. And the truth, whatever it was, sank further and further away. So, as we drift along tonight, think about that. The horse isn't just a story about Troy. It's a story about stories. How they grow, shift, and get repainted until the original event, if there even was one, is buried under layers of imagination. The Trojans might have seen a siege machine, or a ship, or maybe nothing at all. But later generations saw a wooden horse, and then they saw themselves in it, their fears, their morals, their artistic quirks. Which makes the Trojan horse less of a history lesson and more of a mirror. And in the next slow turn of this journey, we'll wander into how the horse followed us into modern times. From Enlightenment scholars scoffing at its impracticality to computer scientists borrowing it for digital viruses, because apparently, once you're a metaphor, you never retire. But for now, Let's leave Virgil's horse standing tall outside Troy, gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, waiting for the inevitable bad decision. Part 4. Skeptics, Ruins, and Trojan Horses with Wi-Fi. So, we've ridden the horse through Homer, Virgil, medieval doodles, and Renaissance glow-ups. But at some point, people started asking the obvious question: did this really happen? And that brings us to the Enlightenment. Picture it: Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. A lot of powdered wigs, a lot of coffee houses, and a growing obsession with reason, with a capital R. Stories like the Trojan Horse didn't exactly sit well with reason. Wooden animals stuffed with warriors? That wasn't logic, that was folklore. And the Enlightenment thinkers were not going to waste their precious candlelight on folklore. So they started poking holes. How big would this horse have had to be? They asked. Where did the Trojans find a gate wide enough? How did 50 or so sweaty soldiers hide inside a box all day without someone coughing, sneezing, or asking where the nearest bathroom was? Reason, unfortunately for Homer and Virgil, doesn't care about poetic flair. It just cares about logistics. And the logistics of the Trojan horse, well, they fall apart pretty fast. The skeptics concluded the obvious. The horse was a metaphor, or an exaggeration, or just plain fiction. A clever campfire story that somehow survived long enough to end up in school curriculums. But then the 19th century arrived, and with it, one of history's most enthusiastic, chaotic figures, Heinrich Schliemann. Now, Schliemann was not exactly the poster child for careful scholarship. He was more like Indiana Jones, if Indiana Jones had less charm and a worrying tendency to smash things. But he did one thing right. He actually went looking for Troy. In the 1870s, Schliemann dug into a hill in modern Turkey called Hisarlik. And lo and behold, he found ruins. Layers of them, cities built, destroyed, and rebuilt on the same site. Suddenly, Troy wasn't just a bedtime story. It was a place, a real city that had actually existed. And that gave the horse, well, not credibility exactly, but at least a stage to stand on. The archaeology, of course, has been messy. Schliemann got overexcited and dug straight through layers like a kid opening presents, destroying priceless evidence in the process. Later archaeologists tried to fix his chaos, but to this day, debates rage over which layer, Troy 6, Troy 7A, Troy 7B, was the Troy. Signs of destruction were definitely found. Burned walls, collapsed structures, scattered remains. Something violent happened there. Was it war? Earthquake? Famine? Pick your poison. The evidence can be read all three ways, which is probably why scholars still argue about it over conference coffee breaks, nodding gravely while secretly wishing they could just say giant horse and call it a day. Meanwhile, the horse itself slipped further into the land of symbol. By the modern era, it wasn't really about Troy anymore. It was about human gullibility. The idea of the Trojan horse became shorthand for hidden danger. A gift that isn't really a gift. A smile that hides teeth. And of course, in the 20th century, it found a brand new home. Computers. Now, whoever first decided to call malicious software a Trojan horse deserves a medal for effective metaphor, because the imagery is perfect. A harmless-looking file you click on, a game, a document, a song. You let it inside your digital city walls, And then out pop the hidden warriors, viruses, malware, spyware, the works. The ancient Trojans may have lost their city, but in a sense, they achieved immortality by lending their biggest blunder to the world of technology. Somewhere Cassandra is rolling her eyes yet again. And it doesn't stop there. The horse pops up in politics, business, advertising. Every time someone wants to warn you about hidden threats, out trots the horse. Need to sell an op-ed about sneaky foreign policy? Call it a Trojan horse. Want to dramatize the dangers of fast food, social media, or your competitor's budget airline? Slap on the horse. Instant gravitas. It's proof that once a metaphor gets rolling, you can't stop it. 2.5 millennia later, and we're still dragging that wooden horse into new contexts. And then there's Hollywood. Because of course there is. If a story has even a whiff of drama, Hollywood will adapt it, and the Trojan horse is cinematic catnip. Sometimes you get the classic image, a giant horse statue, gleaming under torchlight. Sometimes it gets creative. In some modern retellings, the horse is skipped entirely, directors deciding it's too silly. In others, the horse gets exaggerated into something wildly impractical, like a massive tower the size of an apartment block. And of course, the 2004 movie Troy went with the full horse, wooden beams and all, because, well, you can't sell popcorn without at least one iconic prop. Never mind that it makes no sense. Never mind that the logistics are laughable. It looks good on screen, and sometimes that's all a myth needs. So where does that leave us? The Enlightenment laughed at the horse, archaeologists gave it a backdrop, modern culture gave it endless metaphorical second lives. What started as maybe a siege machine or a mistranslated ship is now a symbol for human folly in every context imaginable. From Troy's burning walls to your antivirus software's pop-up warnings. The horse is less a piece of history and more a traveling suitcase. Every age packs into it whatever moral, metaphor, or marketing gimmick they need. Let's rest here for a moment because this is the heart of the story. The Trojan horse probably never existed. Not as wood, not as wheels, not as a gift statue dragged through Troy's gates. But in another way, it has always existed. In our minds, in our metaphors, in every story that warns us not to take things at face value. And maybe that's why we're still talking about it tonight. Because we've all rolled a Trojan horse into our own city at some point. We've all accepted the shiny gift, ignored the warning voice, and woken up to a metaphorical fire. The myth survives because the lesson does. And in the final stretch of this long, sleepy ride, we'll gather the horse one more time. We'll pull together the archaeology, the myths, the metaphors, and we'll leave it where it belongs, not at the gates of Troy, but in the endless stable of human imagination. But for now, let's let the horse rest, still, silent, looming at the edge of memory, waiting for someone, somewhere, to open the gates again. Final part. Closing the gates. So here we are. We've spent quite a while wandering in circles around a horse that may or may not have ever existed. And if you're still awake at this point, congratulations. You're either deeply committed to ancient history, or you've got some very resilient insomnia. Either way, let's gather the loose threads of this story and tuck them in like blankets before we say goodnight. We started with Homer, who somehow left out the horse almost entirely. We moved through Virgil, who turned it into a grand Roman tragedy. We lingered with medieval scribes who doodled it into delightful nonsense, and Renaissance painters who made it glamorous again. We peered over the shoulders of Enlightenment skeptics who decided the horse was more fairy tale than fact. And we ended up in modern times, with the horse sneaking onto our computer screens as malware, onto our political headlines as metaphors, and onto Hollywood backlots as cinematic set pieces. Through it all, one thing is clear: the horse endures. Now, did a literal wooden horse roll into Troy? Probably not. The logistics alone make it laughable. 50 men crammed inside like a sweaty sauna, waiting patiently for nightfall? No thank you. More likely, if there was a horse, it was something else. A siege engine, a warship, a poetic metaphor for an earthquake. Or maybe it was simply a story, an embellishment added by storytellers who knew that people remember symbols better than statistics. Because while walls fall, names fade, and ruins crumble, a story about a horse, that lasts forever. The horse works because it's simple. One image, one moral. Don't trust gifts that seem too good. Don't ignore the voice warning you in the corner. Don't drag something suspicious into your safe space just because it looks pretty. The Trojans in the myth ignored Cassandra. They ignored Laocoon. They chose hope over caution and paid the price. And whether or not they actually did that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that the story reminds us, gently, quietly, not to repeat it. Of course, we all do. We all have our Trojan horses. They don't always look like giant statues on wheels. Sometimes they look like relationships, sometimes like shiny gadgets, sometimes like an email link promising free coupons. But the effect is the same. We open the gates, we let it in, and only later do we realize the mistake. That's why the story lingers. Not because of carpentry or archaeology, but because the horse lives inside us. And yet, it's also funny. There's something charming about the absurdity of it all. An entire civilization undone by a giant lawn ornament. Generations of poets, monks, and painters squabbling over how big the horse should be, or what it looked like, or how many soldiers could realistically fit inside. It's history's ultimate game of telephone, except the word being passed along was always just horse. And here we are thousands of years later, still repeating it, still smiling at it, still turning it over in our heads like a wooden toy passed from one era to another. So tonight, as we close the gates on this story, maybe the lesson isn't to scoff at the Trojans, or to pretend we'd be smarter. Maybe it's to acknowledge that sometimes we need the horse. We need the myths, the symbols, the bedtime stories. We need the gentle warning wrapped in something memorable. Because without the horse, Troy is just another ruined city, another layer of stones in the earth. With the horse, it becomes a legend. And perhaps that's the greatest trick of all. Not the Greeks sneaking into Troy, not the Trojans ignoring their prophets, but the story itself, sneaking into our memory, refusing to leave, always waiting behind the gates of history. So, let's leave it there. The horse stands still in the moonlight, wheels quiet, flanks gleaming with firelight. The Trojans sleep for now. The Greeks wait inside, patient, hidden. The poets hum their verses, and we drift away, letting the story fold back into the silence it came from. Thank you for staying with me tonight, through wood and walls and whispers of ancient ruins. Close your eyes, let the horse fade, and rest easy, knowing that even the most gullible city in history still gave us something worth dreaming about.